CMV, if police officers are to be armed, then cases of killing by police should place the burden of proof on the officer. My rationale is simple: innocent until proven guilty. My proposal may sound like a blatant contradiction of this principle, but I hope to illustrate why I don't believe it is. In a criminal trial, the burden of proof lies on the prosecution to demonstrate beyond all reasonable doubt that the defendant committed a certain crime. Cases of police killing are currently framed as the officer, defendant, against the state, prosecution. However, police officers are a part of the legal system, just on the enforcement side. To allow officers to carry guns implicitly grants them approval to kill in situations in which they consider it necessary to do so. These situations are analogous to a death row trial in which the officer is the prosecution and the victim is the defendant. However, in this case the officer has additionally acted as judge, jury, and executioner, and the sentence has already been carried out. The officer should be required to prove beyond reasonable doubt why that person's death was necessary in that moment. It should not be the state's job to prove otherwise. Now, if this were to be adopted, I don't think that it necessitates a criminal conviction for the officer, bolded because too many comments have ignored this. If the officer is unable to establish sufficient justification for the killing, they should be fired from their job as an officer, forfeit any benefits they may have accrued from their job, and be barred from ever serving in law enforcement again. If you are truly in a situation in which you fear for your life, the idea of potentially losing your job should pale in comparison. I believe that this system would cause officers to re-evaluate the necessity of killing in the moment and would provide incentive for things like body cameras which could prove their innocence of unjustified killing. I am interested in your idea, however. You'll have to get past the common arguments of "I feared for my life and acted in self-defense," all the stronger if the other person is dead and cannot contradict. Making officers decide if they'll be prosecuted when they draw their weapon will cause delay/conflict and cost LEO lives through hesitation. Officers already are put on administrative leave after a shooting, with review of the case internally. Opening officers to additional risk for every shooting would be an undue burden on an already perilous job. I'm not saying these are good reasons or counterarguments. They are the ones that most come up in these discussions though. Also, to your point, lawyers and judges rely on police protection, they work together daily, and so these proceedings can become a broader internal review, of a sort. If you proposed a citizen review board able to issue civil penalties, including most of what you're talking about, that might have a way forward. With what you've proposed, there's very little likely to change in light of the existing power and legal structures. Making officers decide if they'll be prosecuted when they draw their weapon will cause delay/conflict and cost LEO lives through hesitation. But my proposal isn't to prosecute them as criminals. I know you're not saying that this is your argument, but I don't think that one tracks, because if you are truly in a situation in which you fear for your life, the idea of potentially losing your job should pale in comparison. With what you've proposed, there's very little likely to change in light of the existing power and legal structures. I understand that this is not a change that is realistic to expect. This is more of an ethical argument. And yes, what I am proposing is much more similar to a civilian review board. Changes like this always, in my opinion, miss the economic realities of policing. Here is the relevant part of your post, you/call Frodo. If the officer is unable to establish sufficient justification for the killing, they should at the very least be fired from their job as an officer, forfeit any benefits they may have accrued from their job, and be barred from ever serving in law enforcement again. Now, let's think through the consequences of this. There are really two possible consequences. The first one involves skyrocketing police salaries. Police unions negotiate police salaries, and they cost in the job security, benefits, and transferability of skills. If you suddenly dramatically decrease job security, make it so benefits can be stripped away if a cop fails to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, a very high standard, that they're innocent, and bar them from transferring their skills, you're going to need to compensate them for that. Conservatively, you're looking at probably doubling the average police salary. You're also likely looking at meteoric rises in long-term police salaries. If you've worked somewhere for 30 years and have a large pension, you're going to need a lot of money to convince you to put that pension on the line every single day. The second possible outcome is a drastic decrease in police quality. Let's say you make your changes and don't pay more. Anyone worth their salt is going to go do something else which offers better job security, likely with the added bonus of not getting shot at frequently. So those people leave, and the people who previously got rejected from policing now come in. But what happens when they start to lose their cases due to the incredibly high burden you've put on them? They get fired, and now the people who didn't even make it to the point of getting rejected come in. Iterate this a few more times over the course of a usual career, and suddenly the police are markedly terrible compared to the status quo. So that's the end game of your plan economically: massive increases in police salaries and police budgets, which are usually greater than 90% salary, or god-awful policing. The officer has additionally acted as judge, jury, and executioner. People say this a lot, but that's not anywhere near true. A jury has ample time to hear all the evidence and arguments available, and they do it in a calm, controlled setting. The cop does not. The judge decides on the appropriate sentence as punishment for a crime. Cops don't shoot people to punish them, they shoot in self-defense. And cops don't execute anyone either. Execution is the planned methodical homicide of someone who is restrained with the goal of killing as punishment. None of that applies to a cop who is shooting at someone. His goal is not to kill or punish, it's to protect himself or someone else by neutralizing an imminent deadly threat. The quickest way to neutralize such a threat is to shoot it. The officer has only a couple of seconds in a chaotic environment to make a life and death decision. And you're seriously comparing this to a jury's deliberations where they get to bounce ideas back and forth and consider every nuance in a case for hours as they sit in a safe, quiet environment? That's already the standard. In my state, one can only use deadly force to prevent imminent bodily harm or death to themselves or others, or to stop the commission of a violent crime. Since most police-involved shootings involve people who have pulled weapons on police, those would be justified. OIS are already heavily investigated to make sure they meet that requirement, just as concealed carry permit holders are. I agree a lot with the view and sentiment. However, I think it dodges a lot of pragmatic functions. For example, we need a lot of police. Adding higher education requirement, though I agree, or adding a common source of discharge with cause such as the firearm example, it would increase turnover rate for police, and honestly it may make less PPL want to be cops. As shitty as cops can be, we need a lot of them. It's a dichotomy between improving police skills and actually having enough police to properly enforce the law and maintain peace. What if there simply wasn't enough cops to respond to a domestic disturbance? Response times would only increase. People would only be more dissatisfied with police if they couldn't perform their basic functions. Lastly, the proposed change has a lot of conflict with the police liability in the current system. I feel like a method such as civil responsibility, e.g. suing the police officer, or a police union for cash if they're negligent or use excess force, is a safer approach. Though again, it may make less PPL want to be cops.